Alright, we are back with a new video, and we are back updating the Big Brother 24 power rankings towards the end of week 6, and we got a bit to talk about. Now, admittedly, the power rankings themselves didn't change as much as you would think on the face of it. However, there's still quite a bit of dynamics to get into, quite a bit of potential gameplay. Now, there is a new twist that will come into play on Thursday night following the eviction that will essentially divide the house into two groups, and each group will play out their own round of the game, essentially creating a split tribal similar to what we've seen on Survivor. However, considering that we don't know what those groups are yet, we don't know what effect they'll have on the game, but given this twist, this obviously has the potential to shake things up depending on what the groups end up being, but I cannot reflect that entirely on this week's rankings. So if the rankings do change quite a bit next week, then there's a good chance that that twist will be a big reason why. But for the time being, I'm just going to be going off what we know of the current house and how I see the game playing out from this point forward. But as usual, there are 12 players to talk about, and let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into the ranking. So starting off at number 12, we have the most recent boot to talk about in the final pre-juror of the season, and here we have Daniel. And obviously Daniel, his downfall here was pretty predetermined by this point, and obviously he played a pretty sloppy game where he obviously was the first HOH. He allowed a lot of people to influence him, particularly a lot of those alpha males. They were able to get into his head early on, and through that they formed Oasis. Later on, he built a close bond with Nicole, and it seemed like despite certain points where they could have been in danger, they could have potentially rode it out. However, we then saw during Monty's HOH where Monty literally warned him that Nicole may not have the votes to stay against Taylor if he used the veto, and yet Daniel decided to use the veto anyway, putting his closest ally on the block, and then was pretty shocked when she went home. And from that point on, he was mostly bitter for the most part. It was actually kind of funny seeing how upset he got, like when he was saying that they gave the game to Michael, how they can't split the check 7 ways. I found that pretty funny. And then obviously his exit was, like pretty indicative of the fact that he was disappointed with how he did out there. But I also noticed a lot of people saying that he's a top 10 worst player, and I'm not really willing to go that far, as yes, his move to put up Nicole was pretty bad. However, it's not like he actually put himself into direct danger. I mean, there have been other cases where people have put themselves into direct danger by either using or not using the veto. So I can't really fault Daniel too much for that. And plus, he did at least survive certain rounds. So I can't say he's one of the worst players in Big Brother history, but he's obviously still pretty bad, made a pretty dumb move, and because of that, he is here at number 12. And with that, there are 11 players left to talk about, and as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely it is that they'll win the game from this point. But at number 11, we have the person who is the most likely to be evicted on Thursday night, and here we have Indy. And there isn't too much to say about Indy. I mean, for the most part, she didn't really play the game, and I think a lot of that is because she came on here thinking that she would want to play the game similarly to Big Brother Brazil, which from what I understand is not as social strategy heavy as BBUS is. And for the most part, she wasn't really included on a lot of people's plans. I mean, even with some of the alliances that she was in, I mean, she wasn't really an integral part of it, and she didn't really bother too much to like be a part of the game per se. And now there's been talk about her quitting the jury if she were to be voted out, which isn't great and really highlights how she isn't that interested or invested in the game. And so because of that, despite the fact that she doesn't really care too much about the game, the fact that she is still going to be more likely evicted on Thursday night isn't ideal. And because of that, she is here at number 11. Now we're moving on to number 10, and we have the person that Indy is currently sitting next to on the block. And here we have Terrence. And there's actually a point early on in the week where Terrence could have been the boot. I mean, Taylor did want to target him early on, but it was more through the leftovers saying that they would prefer Indy to be taken out that caused her to back off. And plus, we've heard people like Michael and Brittany say that they want to drag along Terrence as a GOAT, as someone who is easy to beat in comps, which is something at least. I mean, he probably will survive the block. Now, obviously things could change, but more than likely he will probably be dragged through a lot of the game. Now, who knows what could happen with this twist next week? I mean, he could just be an easy target then. But even then, I feel like people like a Jasmine are more likely to be targeted over him, assuming the leftovers themselves don't split. However, Terrence is not really winning this game. I mean, he's not really someone who's primed to do well in the endgame comps, and it's pretty clear that he's being dragged as a GOAT. And without Indy there, I can't really see a jury scenario where he wins. So I can't say that Terrence is poised to win this game, but to his credit, he probably will survive the block on Thursday night, and that's more than I can say with Indy so far. So because of that, he is here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9, and we have someone who arguably should have been targeted this past week, and moving forward, they still will be a prime target, assuming the leftovers don't immediately turn on each other. But here we have Jasmine. And if this were a week ago, I think Jasmine probably would have been one of the next few targets regardless. However, she did get a bit of a lucky break with Taylor winning HOH, and despite her not ideal treatment of Taylor throughout the season, Taylor did agree to not put her up as a black woman, but also the fact that it was Jasmine's birthday this week, as well as her dad's, who passed away in the last year. That's really the only reason that Jasmine wasn't put up, as even other members of the leftovers did suggest targeting her, but it was through Taylor's insistence that Jasmine was not put up, despite the fact that if it were the other way around, Jasmine more than likely would have put up Taylor, but that's neither here nor there. But moving forward, I mean, Jasmine isn't really well liked. Now, she is kind of respected to where she could gain some respect there, but even then, I mean, people have talked about not really liking being around her. She's kind of annoying in some of her interactions and just isn't the best person to live with. And there is talk about her being a target in this coming split. However, there are still ways for her to get out of it, particularly if the leftovers do split, but who knows what will happen there. But even outside of that, I don't really see Jasmine getting too much leverage. Now, there is some opportunity for her to gain some foothold in the game. However, I don't think it's super likely that those opportunities will materialize. So because of that, I do have to leave her here at number 9. Now we're moving on to number 8. And similar to last week, we are now at the highest ranked person to not be in the leftovers right now. And here we have Alyssa. Now, Alyssa was in a bit of a precarious spot this past week where we obviously saw a serious push to backdoor her after the veto, particularly through Joseph and by extension Taylor. Now, it was very unlikely to go through as Kyle was the veto holder and Kyle didn't have too much incentive to use the veto to get out Alyssa. However, even outside of that, I mean, Kyle doesn't really trust Alyssa too much with information, and through that, she isn't in the best spot with him. Now, from what I understand, Kyle will probably stay loyal to her as he really fought to protect her. But even so, I mean, I don't really see too much for her to really get too deep into the game outside of her and Kyle potentially aligning with Michael and Brittany. But even outside of that, there are definitely opportunities for her to be targeted moving forward, particularly if Joseph were to win power. So that's a pretty precarious spot for her. Now, I do think Alyssa still has some room to maneuver a bit more than the people we already talked about. However, there are definitely plenty of danger spots for her in the next couple of weeks. So because of that, I do have to leave her here at number 8. And with that, we are now at the top 7, which is the leftovers, of course. And a lot of focus this week was centered around this division within the leftovers that will probably cause them to turn on each other relatively soon. And it'll be pretty interesting to see who comes out on top here. But at number 7, the person I believe is the least likely to win the game of the leftovers is Monty. And I feel like similar to previous weeks, Monty is such a blatant threat at this point that I don't really see too many people taking him to the very end. Now, again, there is still a chance that the pound could get down to the 4 together. However, I feel like that prospect is increasingly unlikely. And especially now with Kyle and Joseph essentially being at odds. And I feel like with Monty being on the Joseph side, who is a bit more likely to lose out on this war that's brewing, I feel like Monty is someone who will be taken out. Now, admittedly, I don't think Monty is as likely to be the first out of the leftovers as I would have felt like a week ago. However, it's still not great. I still feel like there isn't too many people that are actively willing to take him to the end, so I can't have him too high because of that. So because of that, I do have him here at number 7. Now we're moving on to number 6, and we actually have the first break from last week's placements here, as this person has dropped a bit. However, they were a central figure in the action that played out this week, but here we have Joseph. And I feel like Joseph really overplayed this week and led to some pretty baffling moments. I mean, we saw early on in the week how he literally told Taylor that she should backdoor him in order to hide their relationship. Now, a lot of that does come from Joseph's insistence on playing a double agent, as even now in the jury phase, and even with the leftovers saying that there's no point in really working with the other side anymore, we still see Joseph pushing really hard to maintain this middle position. And the fact that he went so far as to suggest backdooring himself was really an indication of that, but also an indication of how much he's been overplaying. And the fact that there were leftovers that were seriously considering taking him out if that were to happen without Joseph really realizing it is a bit of a knock against his game. But then after the veto, we saw him back off from this suggestion, telling Taylor that's probably not a good idea, which, again, good on him for him realizing that. But the fact that he even suggested that in the first place is pretty ridiculous. And plus, it does open up the door for this conflict between him and Kyle to take place, as the main reason that Kyle won the veto was to implement the Joseph backdoor plan. And then Joseph essentially took what happened after the veto and tried to flip the script onto Kyle by trying to convince him to backdoor Alyssa, which was very unlikely to happen. And it should have been clear to Joseph that it was unlikely to happen, particularly with Kyle holding the veto and him just pushing so hard for Kyle to use the veto when it was so clear that Kyle was never going to use it, really helped sow this division within the leftovers. And it's at the point now where Kyle and Joseph are essentially going to be going after each other in future weeks. Now, granted, the split house twist could help him to a degree, but I still feel like Joseph is going to be such a massive threat. And while it didn't necessarily start with this week, I feel like what happened this week really accelerated Joseph's target in the eyes of people like a Kyle, that makes it more unlikely that Joseph will actually get to the end. Now, the main reason I do have him above Monty, however, is that I feel like Joseph has a bit more allies than a Monty. I mean, Taylor seems pretty loyal to him at this point, and I feel like that's something you can give him credit for. The fact that he was able to influence Taylor's HOH to the extent that he did, that does give me a bit more faith in Joseph to get a bit deeper into the game than Monty. But similar to Monty, I feel like his threat level is so high at this point, and I wouldn't be surprised if he was taken out in the next couple of weeks, that I can't have him too much higher than this. So because of that, he is here at number 6. Now we're moving on to number 5, and I'm sure some people will think this person is a bit too high considering what happened this week. However, considering the fact that I feel like there are other people who are more likely to be targeted immediately than this person, I feel like this placement is good enough for them. But still, they did not play it that well this week. But here we have Taylor, the current HOH. And yeah, she did not play this HOH particularly well at all, where early on she seemed to be pretty up in the air about who she wanted to nominate, not entirely sure what she wanted to do. And considering that this should have been a relatively straightforward week in putting up Terrence and Indy, I mean, the fact that she really spent a lot of time deliberating between putting up like Turner and Monty as initial noms, or putting up Turner at some point. I mean, all this was pretty suspect and didn't make her look good in the eyes of her allies at all. And then eventually she does settle on Terrence and Indy, who do eventually end up being the final nominees. But the way in which that goes down is pretty bad on Taylor's end, where throughout a lot of the week, she seems to be influenced a lot by Joseph, and she seems pretty receptive to his ideas. I mean, first he suggests backdooring himself, and Taylor just goes along with this for whatever reason, despite the fact that it's completely unnecessary and would have opened up the door for Joseph to be taken out by some of the leftovers. I mean, that's not particularly ideal. And then after the veto, I mean, she seems very ambivalent over the Alyssa backdoor plan and seems to be deferring directly to Joseph for a lot of that, which really weakens her relationship with Michael and Brittany to the point where Michael excludes her from his final 3, as he sees her as kind of an extension of Joseph to a large degree. And I feel like there's still potential for her to be taken out through the split house, depending on who wins HOH, as she didn't really do much to build much favor with the people outside the leftovers, particularly Jasmine, who she promised to not put up because of the fact that it's her dad's birthday this week and didn't want to, burden her that way, despite the fact that Jasmine has shown no loyalty towards Taylor throughout the entire season. And I feel like Jasmine still could potentially target Taylor, depending on how the certain HOH or veto results go. Now, she isn't the immediate target. I feel like Monty and Joseph are more likely targets coming into this twist. However, there's still potential for Taylor to be going out, depending on how the veto goes, so it's still not a great spot for her to be in. And the fact that Michael kicked her out of his final 3 isn't great either. Now, admittedly, she is still close to Brittany. There is at least that. But the fact that she came out of this week in a worse position than she came into the week is enough to leave her here at number 5. Now we're moving on to number 4, and I feel like this was a debate for me between the number 4 and number 3 spot, as I feel like each of these two players have pretty big knocks to their game so far, and it was just a matter of the order for me. But at number 4, I still went with the person who probably has the worst long-term prospects in terms of actually winning the game, but has an arguably better position in terms of getting there. But here we have Brittany. And I actually feel like Brittany played this week better than the number 3 person. However, they still have the problem of winning a jury vote. I'm not entirely sure how they win the jury vote given who she wants to go to the end with. I mean, she still wants to go to the end with Michael and Taylor, two people who would beat her in a jury vote at the end. And that's not particularly great in my eyes. And that's a big reason why I hesitate putting her much higher than this. However, the main reason I do put her above like Monty, Joseph, Taylor is that, again, she has better security within the game than those people, to where I feel like all three of those people have possibilities where they go home through the split tribal, while Brittany is pretty safe, all things considered. And considering the fact that Michael and Brittany were kind of playing the middle and did a lot of work to stoke this Kyle and Joseph war, I mean, that does give Brittany a pretty good spot here. And considering the fact that Michael seems more likely to take the heat for that if things were to go downhill, I feel like that does put Brittany in a pretty good spot. So that's at least enough to have her above those people. But still, the fact that I'm not sure how she wins a jury vote at this stage, that does lead me to put her here at number 4. Now we're moving on to number 3. And as I alluded to a moment ago, I feel like this person played this particular week worse. And I feel like this person has really demonstrated themselves over the course of the season to be a pretty sloppy player. However, they're still in a pretty good position and probably poised to do well moving forward. But here we have Kyle. And as I said, I feel like Kyle did not play this week particularly well at all, where he ends up winning the veto in a spot where a lot of the leftovers are expecting him to use the veto to backdoor Alyssa. And obviously, he doesn't really have much intention of doing that, as he sees Alyssa as one of his closer allies. However, it's through him being perceived as being open to backdoor Alyssa in the first place that does put him in a lot of trouble there. And it's to the point now where Joseph is actively going after him and Alyssa. Now, granted, I think Kyle has the upper hand in this war, as he's probably still has Michael and Brittany's support. Now, granted, Michael and Brittany are planning to play the middle as much as they can to avoid them getting into trouble there. But I do think at the end of the day, Michael and Brittany would side with him over Joseph there. But still, the fact that he ends up in this position to begin with, and the fact that he ends up getting in trouble, is still a pretty big knock to his game. And on top of that, I don't feel like he's handled his relationship with Alyssa the best either, where despite him going so far out of his way to protect Alyssa, I mean, we saw in recent days that Alyssa is picking up on the fact that he's not giving her much information, and he's telling her to not tell anyone the information he's sharing, which in turn makes her question how much he really trusts her, which isn't great either. So he's kind of getting the worst of both worlds. Now, I can still see him repairing his relationship with Alyssa. Like, it's not a super dire situation at this time being. And I feel like as time goes on, I have a bit more faith in Kyle to recover what he's lost compared to Joseph, who I feel like at this point is probably too big of a target to ever get back down from there. But still, the fact that he played this week so poorly and doesn't really reflect too good on him as a player overall is a big worry for me, and a big reason that I do leave Kyle here at number 3. Now we're moving on to number 2, and we have a bit of a jump for this person from this past week. However, I feel like as time goes on, it really has become clear that this person is in a pretty good position. Granted, a lot of that will be dependent on what happens to the leftovers and the pound from this point, but I still feel somewhat good about this player. But here we have Turner. And I feel like for a lot of the season, my hesitancy with putting Turner too high is the fact that he's too passive in the game. I mean, again, yes, he was the HOH when the leftovers were created, but he was one of the least instrumental people in creating the leftovers to begin with. And he actively wanted to go along with the house, like, and going along with what Jasmine wanted, up until Kyle was the one to approach him with creating the leftovers to begin with. So I never felt like Turner was too active as a player, and even this week, I didn't really get the best sense of him doing too much to better his game. And there's also his rivalry with Jasmine, which doesn't really affect the game too much, but is still kind of worth noting here. However, I will concede at this point that Turner is in a pretty solid position. I mean, no one's really targeting him in the near future, and I feel like he is pretty set to get pretty deep into the game here. Now, I feel like a lot of his future in the game will be dependent on how much the leftovers stick together, which doesn't seem super promising considering the fact that Kyle and Joseph will be going after each other, and how much Turner will be able to maneuver what happens once the leftovers do fall apart. So that is a bit of a worry for me. But still, the fact that he seems to be in a pretty good position short term, and I still have some confidence in him to win some competitions in the end game, does make me feel pretty good about him. But I feel like the number one person did play this week a bit better. So because of that, I do have him here at number 2. And now at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Big Brother 24 right now is Michael. Now, I will say up front that I don't think Michael played this week perfectly. I mean, there were definitely a couple points where he was kind of caught playing the middle a bit too much, and I don't think he dealt with being confronted in the best possible way. So it's not like he played the week perfectly per se. However, he was largely effective in creating this sort of civil war between Kyle and Joseph, where he was a big reason why the Taylor and Joseph side pushed so hard to get Kyle to backdoor Alyssa. And the fact that that conflict really what drove the gameplay over this past week really sets up the future to where the Pound is now kind of going after the Kyle and Alyssa side, and Michael and Brittany are more or less playing the middle of the situation. Now, I still think, again, there are still some potential for Michael to get exposed down the road. However, the fact that no one's really caught on to that so far is a pretty promising sign for me. And also the fact that this conflict is even happening, and the fact that the Kyle and Joseph side are going after each other, the fact that Michael is setting it up so that Kyle is the one to take the first shot at the Joseph and Monty side of things is something that could put Michael and Brittany into a very solid position moving forward. And I feel like that's pretty good for Michael's game, as he's going to need to get out those big threats so that he can potentially win his way to the end. Now, I still think long term, he's still probably going to be seen as a pretty big threat. I mean, while no one's really talking about him right now, I still think there is plenty of potential for him to be viewed at as the pretty big threat. And like I said, potential for him to be caught. But the fact that he came out this week seemingly in a good spot with this conflict really brewing, the fact that there are now people willing to take shots at the leftovers while Michael and Brittany are in a pretty central position is pretty good for Michael. And I feel like Michael stands to benefit the most from this current predicament, assuming he doesn't get ratted out and blamed for a lot of it. So it's because of that I do give Michael a lot of credit here. And I feel like going into this split vote here, Michael should be in a pretty good spot, regardless of whether the leftovers turn on each other or whether they stick to one of the more traditional targets and like a Jasmine or Terrence. But for now, considering everything that we know, I feel pretty confident about Michael. He is the most likely to win in my eyes right now. And because of that, he is here at number 1. And there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out with the channel. I'll be back again next week to update the power rankings again, so stay tuned for that. I'm also covering Survivor SA right now, which has been a lot of fun, so stay tuned for power rankings on that. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server. I'll leave a link to join in the description. A lot of stuff coming your way. But for now, that is the video. See ya.